You're listening to the Better for America podcast, presented by Amac, the Association of Mature American Citizens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your Amac podcast, Better for America. Today, we are joined by a true foreign policy leader, a seasoned voice on a wide range of global issues, and a former top Trump administration official. She has a resume like no other, ranging from winning beauty pageants in her youth to work with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, from graduating Florida Southern with a BA to earning multiple master's degrees. She has held senior roles at USAID, the U.S. Treasury, and in the private sector. And she is also a Navy reservist. Most recently, she was the U.S. State Department spokesperson for the Trump administration from 2019 forward, and has been an incisive, thoughtful, and persuasive voice on issues from communist China to Iran. She was also central to the path-breaking peace agreement secured by President Trump called the Abraham Accords. Today, I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and help me welcome a real leader, a proven patriot, Morgan Ortagus. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Oh, wonderful. Morgan, with all that you have done, and it's really hard to know where to begin. You have an incredible resume. Let me say, more than 2 million AMAC members, we are really privileged, and we thank you so much for being with us, because you have really been in the crucible, I like to call it, the center of so much of what was happening in the Trump administration, and you were part of some genuinely historic events. So I wanted to jump right in, if I may, to the Abraham Accords, the unprecedented bilateral peace agreements that President Trump managed to secure between Israel and different Arab countries in the Middle East. And I think to many of us, it almost seemed that President Trump was doing what so many said was impossible. He gave that extraordinary speech in Saudi Arabia at the beginning when he was saying peace was possible. And then he began to deliver. He seemed to change the whole way of thinking about Middle East peace. And he realized that getting these bilateral agreements might allow a wider strategy to emerge. So because you were a part of that, I was hoping that you could help share with our listeners what were some of the basic facts. And the bigger question here, I guess, right, is can we ever get to lasting peace in the Mideast?
Gosh, that's such a massive, big issue to take on, but I'll do my best. So let me just say, I think for many people with resumes and backgrounds like myself, working on peace between Israel and Arab states is something that you expect to do your entire career. And you sort of hope that maybe at the end of your career that you have a breakthrough. It was overwhelming and astounding for us to be able to have 4 peace deals, 4 agreements to normalize relations between Israel and 4 different Arab states. And really, it was the culmination of 4 years of policies that led to that point in 2020, whenever we were able to unveil the Abraham Accords. Because a lot of people wonder, oh, how did you do it, right? And we really took the playbook that many people have been operating by, the foreign policy, quote unquote, experts, the people who had been doing this for entire years. We really decided to rewrite that playbook. So when President Trump came in, he said, it doesn't make sense to me that we have Israel, who is one of our greatest allies, one of our greatest friends. And then, of course, we have the Gulf Arab states, who are also very important partners in the Middle East and the region. And we have taken, under the Obama administration, under the JCPOA, we have taken their greatest enemy, not just the threat to the United States. Iran is, of course, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, as submitted and as verified by multiple Republican and Democrat administrations. They have not just taken someone who's an enemy of the United States. They've taken the enemy of our closest friends and allies in the region, and empowered that enemy with billions of dollars in sanctions relief, with pallets full of cash, as everybody knows from the Wall Street Journal report. And ergo, you have empowered an enemy, and then you've taken all of these actions to reprimand or to sidelines our friends and allies, most especially and very vividly the UN vote against settlements in Israel, where we abstained at the UN vote at the 11th hour of the Obama administration. It was really, really shameful and cowardly act by Secretary Kerry and President Obama. So you sort of come to the situation and you're like, well, this is not how I'd operate in business, right? Trump looked at it and said, this is not how I would operate in business. This is not how I would operate in life. I'm not going to take the people that I have close relationships with and empower their biggest competitor. How does that make any sense, right? No one operates that way, except of course our asinine foreign policy, swamp experts in Washington, D.C. So what we decided to do was, again, to empower the state of Israel. We did what U.S. law requires us to do, which is to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Everyone thought this was such a radical move done by President Trump. Mind you, it was the law of the land. Congress had literally, for decades, been passing, waivers so that the U.S. embassy remained in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem. Again, President Trump looked at that and said, what really makes more sense to me is to follow the law, not to pass waivers as an excuse for not following the law. And similarly, we stuck by the Gulf Arab states in some very tough times. That doesn't mean that we excused all of their behavior. That doesn't mean that we didn't have human rights conversations with them, but we understood as friends and as partners that we could lead them together towards a better path. And so what really happens is you have 4 years of reversing policies that were very dangerous and very harmful to our friends and allies. Remind you, when the JCPOA was negotiated by John Kerry and President Obama and Wendy Sherman, who's the current Deputy Secretary of State, guess who wasn't included at the table for those negotiations? The Israelis, the Gulf Arab states who are directly impacted. I've often said this, that it reeks of colonialism. The United States and Western countries, mind you, mostly white people at the negotiating table, telling the brown people, telling the Arabs and Jews, no, you guys go sit down. We'll take care of this for you. I mean, it's so arrogant to approach the Middle East that way. And it's just such a colonial behavior. No, we can negotiate with your biggest enemy for you, right? No matter the fact that they will be the ones that were most greatly affected. So I know I'm long-winded on the subject because I'm passionate about it, but I'll just wrap and say that when we got to the point of starting to discuss, and it was first with UAE, about how we could have the Abraham Accords, how we could have peaceful and open relationships between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 4 years of reversing what we felt were really wrong, harmful, and disastrous policies pursued by the Obama administration and probably likely pursued by the Biden administration. We'll see. Jury is still out. So just to wrap up, do I think it can be lasting peace? Yes. This has outlived us. If you go on Twitter right now, or you follow any of the news outlets that are covering Abraham Accords, you'll see every day that these countries are exchanging ambassadors. They're exchanging representatives. They're opening embassies and consulates. They're opening new trade relationships, new tourism relationships, new business relationships. So yes, the genie is out of the bottle. And one of the things that I always said was most beautiful about this moment is that little Jewish children in Israel and Arab children, both in Israel and in the Gulf Arab states, we're not going to grow up the way that you and I did, where if you go to Israel, you have a separate passport, or you ask them not to stamp your passport so that you could go to the other countries in the Middle East. They'll grow up thinking that it's totally normal for, a little Emirati boy to go on vacation in Tel Aviv, or a little girl from Jerusalem, to visit Manama, right, for the weekend. And that's going to be normal to children. And that's what's really, really going to change the Middle East and make sure that this is a lasting peace.
Wow. Well, you really have seen so much experience in this area. And I do want to pivot to another big issue, one that only seems to be getting bigger, and that is China, because we see communist China, they seem to be getting bigger and bigger on the U.S. horizon. Trump called them out and he changed the entire conversation, but we're seeing a sense of indifference for decades now. We're seeing it again beyond the internal human rights issues that we're seeing, the human abuses, the usurping of power in Hong Kong and threatening Taiwan and such. Matter of fact, I just read a few days ago, I believe it was a Chinese rocket was projectile into space, fell into orbit. Yes, this hypersonic. Thank you. I do want to speak with you about it. It actually circled the globe, landed, just miles away from the original target. And so I think somebody who looks at things as you do from multiple points of view, both from the private sector, which is wonderful to have that perspective, former government, of course, and the military perspective. Morgan, help us really understand how big a threat China is and how big of a threat they are from the military, cyber, and trade and even geopolitical perspective. If you could, I think our listeners would
Sure.
be really interested in your perspective. Thank you.
Well, let's touch on the hypersonic just because it's in the news. And listen, I am in the military in the Navy Reserves, and so. But listen, I don't know. I'm not a weapons expert. I don't know everything about everything, but I do, try to do quite a bit of research in this area. So the best way I think that I can describe it, if you think of a nuclear weapon, if you think of a volleyball game, right? The nuclear weapon is the volleyball. The ICBM, we've heard that talked about a lot, especially, obviously in context of what North Korea is building. The ICBM is the way in which most countries will launch the nuclear weapon. Now, we have systems, we have, defense systems in the United States that will protect us from that. We would see an ICBM coming, we would be able to interdict it. So think of it sort of like if the nuclear weapon is a volleyball, then the ICBM is sort of a slow, underhanded pitch. And that for decades has been the status quo, right? In the nuclear arms race, is people get an ICBM in order to be able to deploy that weapon. And of course, we in the United States have defense capabilities against a nuclear weapon that is launched via an ICBM. We do not, at this current time, have the capability to defend ourselves against a nuclear weapon that is launched via a hypersonic. So you can think, again, continuing to use this volleyball analogy, you can think of, you've got the volleyball, a hypersonic is basically like, doing a spike, right, over the net, right? It could come, we can't detect it. It could come in very quickly. It could surprise us. And that is, I don't understand why everyone's not more hyped up about this. Like I am. Sometimes I feel like I'm yelling into the wind about these things. But that is really scary. It's really scary that the country that is our biggest, competitor and sometimes adversary would have the ability potentially, obviously this is a first, this is a first test, but we could potentially have the ability to hit us with a nuclear weapon in a way that we can not only not detect, but we can't defend against. So this conversation, this is happening in the middle of a conversation happening in Washington, where Washington Democrats are talking about cutting defense spending. And I'm just sort of going, is anyone reading the news? Right?
Yeah.
Is anyone noticing that our adversaries are developing capabilities that we can't defend ourselves against? So this is obviously incredibly big news, but I think that's just one, piece of the relationship with China. Now, I would say over the past, 40 years or so, plus since Nixon opened to China, there was sort of this bipartisan theory in Washington that China was going to grow, they were going to become an economic might, they would eventually rival us. So we sort of saw that off on the horizon, Republicans and Democrats. And both sides made the conscious effort to open up to China. Let's do business there, let's trade with them. And we thought, listen, the richer that they become, right, the greater their economy becomes, the more business ties between our country, the more likely it is that their political system will moderate and that the country themselves will slowly moderate. Now, I don't disagree with that theory. I think it made a lot of sense at the time. But when Chairman Xi came to power and sort of declared himself emperor for life, he started making decisions, and little by little, year by year, month by month, you really could start to see, I think especially around the beginning of the Trump administration, you could start to see what Chairman Xi was doing, and that he had no intention of moderating the communist political party, the Chinese Communist Party. He had no intention of moderating them, and in fact, he wanted to sort of, I think, really resurrect this grand vision of what China could be, led by the Communist Party. And so I think that framework is really important for us to think about now, because we are long overdue for a mindset, not only in Washington, because let me tell you, I've lived in and out of Washington, D.C. for almost 20 years. And I can tell you, I'm living in Nashville now. And I can tell you, it's not, the real thinking is not going to come from Washington, D.C. It's going to come from your listeners and from people around this country that stand up and recognize what the national security threats are to our country. So don't ever feel like that this problem is too overwhelming or too much for you to handle, or I'm just listening to this podcast or watching this podcast in Topeka, and how could I make a difference? All of us can make a difference, because it's time that we start demanding of our elected leaders that they pay attention to the threat coming from the Chinese Communist Party under Chairman Xi, under the chairman of the party. They have absolutely no intention of moderating their behavior. In fact, they seek to basically kick the United States out of Asia. They want to control Asia, right? They don't want us to have a sphere of influence there, and they eventually want to dominate every multilateral, multinational institution, the United Nations, the WHO, right? You could go through the list. They've had the very smart and careful plan of inserting their people in and making sure that they get control over these global organizations that the United States and so many others are involved in. One of the biggest challenges we have is that it all comes, I mean, Clinton was right when he said, what was it, in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. Bill Clinton was totally right about that, because what it comes down to is that our closest friends and allies and partners around the world, guess who their number one trading partner is? It isn't us.
Sure.
It isn't us. It's the Chinese. And so I would just close by saying, I always try to say, when I warn of the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, I always like to remind viewers and listeners that the two people that were really most influential with Secretary Mike Pompeo on policy towards China were two Chinese Americans, two amazing guys that worked for us, that grew up there. They understood the totalitarianism of the communist ideology. They understood how dangerous it is. So I always want to say that I think it's important that we cherish our Chinese American and Asian American citizens here in the United States. That's who Mike Pompeo most depended on. And even though we do have to fight the battle with the communists, we don't fight it with our fellow Chinese American citizens here at home.
Wow, really, really sobering facts. I have to tell you, though, I can relate. After I watched that, I read that article, rather, I was literally in my bathroom getting ready, and I'm saying to my husband, how is this possible? How are they having these missiles, these nuclear bombs that they can just, and a sense of panic. And I love that message of people really being paying attention to these details and knowing who you're voting for and knowing where they stand on the issues.
Absolutely.
That is a huge, wonderful message. I do want to turn from communist China to another threat, actually two of them, which seem to loom on the horizon. First, I wanted you to help us better understand what I'm calling sort of the strange, repressive, and oddly threatening nature of North Korea. You mentioned North Korea. And then if you can help us understand what Iran is up to. And then I know you've got to go and you don't have a lot of time. I want to finish with one last question, bringing us right back here at home. But can you touch quickly on North Korea and Iran, please?
Oh, gosh, you're giving me all the hard ones today. Okay. North Korea is weird, right? It's one of the most complicated countries that we have to deal with because it's so closed, and we don't have the traditional. We obviously don't have embassies and consulates there. Most of our allies don't. So all of the normal, even in Iran, you can get information. You can sort of understand where Iranians are coming from because we do have so many friends and allies that interact with them that the culture is not completely closed. But when you have an entirely closed country like you do with Iran, it makes it very challenging to read them. I will say, as State Department spokesperson, it was one of those things, everything that I said about North Korea, everything was carefully parsed. And so often the people working on North Korea would give me 2 lines and they would say, Morgan, you can only read these 2 lines. You can't deviate, don't ad lib, don't say anything else. And I always sort of hated getting a question on North Korea because I knew I would have to just read these 2 lines and not be able to, do my thing that you do as a spokesperson. So listen, we've sort of been at a stalemate with them. I will say that President Trump, meeting with Kim Jong-un, we got them to stop testing ICBMs in our administration. We got them for the first time. There was a leader-to-leader agreement on denuclearization. And a lot of people can be critical and say, but they didn't actually denuclearize, they didn't do all these things. Sure. But with North Korea, the little steps can take decades, to make. And so we were proud of those accomplishments because we got Kim Jong-un on record with a commitment to denuclearize. Now, will that eventually happen? I think that's one of those, portfolios when any administration, I don't envy the Biden administration having to tackle this, because because they so often do not respond to the traditional levers in foreign policy because they are such a closed society. It makes it very challenging to come up with options. So one of the other things that we were really proud of is when Nikki Haley was at the UN, we were able to secure the toughest sanctions on North Korea that had ever been delivered at the UN, and people were actually complying with them. So therefore, I think I think that we were able to, in the 4 years that we had, which is a very small time whenever you think of the life of the North Korea portfolio, we were able to have a few big accomplishments. And the only thing that I think the Biden administration, when you think what arrows do they have in their quiver, I would hope that they will continue to enforce the sanctions that we were able to pursue and get passed at the United Nations. But talking about sanctions, it's a good transition to Iran, because I would say the problem is whenever you don't enforce sanctions in one country, when you let sanctions slide on one country, it's really hard to enforce them with other countries. So what do I mean by that? So the Biden administration really has not been enforcing the sanctions that are on the book on Iran right now. They wanted to, I'm related to the oil sanctions specifically, they wanted to throw Iran a bone. They wanted to get them to the negotiating table. They wanted to get back into the JCPOA. And so this is the problem that I think whenever you have sanctions on the book that you don't enforce, from my opinion, it's better to take them off, right? It's better not to have them than to have them on the books and not enforce them. And that permeates, into other regions. Like, well, if I'm China and if I don't have to obey the oil sanctions on Iran, which they're not doing right now, the United States is not forcing them. If I'm not obeying them in Iran, why would I, for example, obey them in North Korea? So I think number one, I think having credibility in that sanctions space is incredibly important. And another, what feels like a lifetime ago, I was a sanctions analyst, intelligence analyst at the Treasury Department in Washington, and we did a lot on sanctions enforcement, obviously. So we have a situation where we came in, not we, the Biden administration came in to deal with Iran and said, the Trump people are so stupid. We're going back into the JCPOA. We're so sorry. We should have never gotten out of it. Apologizing, capitulating, being weak, which, I really would genuinely love, just for once, the Democrats to show me an example of where being weak and pitiful in a negotiation actually paid off. I mean, it's their chosen tactic so many times that I just wonder, okay, when does this work for you guys? But that's, I guess, another point.
Good point.
So we went through all of these rounds of negotiations. Between, of course, again, I might point out, even in these latest negotiations, Israel, Gulf Arab states not at the table. So you've got this visual of all these white Americans and white Europeans, the same people who talk about racial equity and justice in the United States are the same people who don't let the brown people to the table at the negotiations with Iran and the people who are most affected by them. And I think that is kindly saying that is a little hypocritical, in my opinion. And so here they are back at the table since the beginning of the Biden administration. Well, there's a new election in Iran in June. They not only elect, incredible hardliners in Iran. They literally put a bunch of terrorists and people that are designated at the United Nations, not just in the United States, but they're designated in the United States, but people that are designated at the United Nations. Those are people in cabinet positions in Iran. So we have an incredibly sticky situation in that, in my opinion, the Iranians have told Rob Malley and the negotiating team at the State Department to buzz off. And to, that they're basically shown that they have no interest in going back in the JCPOA. And the correct response is, and again, in my opinion, what we tried to get back in the JCPOA. You guys aren't listening. We're going to go back to the maximum economic pressure campaign that the Trump administration put on. But simply because it was our idea, I think they're not going to do it. So maybe, I don't know, maybe they'll end up calling it another name. and doing something similar, but all the sanctions are still in the book, so that's a good thing. They just need to enforce them. And this current regime has shown absolutely no desire to go back into any agreements with us. And by the way, we always said, for any of this to ever pass Congress as a treaty, which the JCPOA was not brought before Congress as a treaty, because it would have gotten voted, would have been voted down. But we always said, even Blinken said this in his testimony whenever he was testifying to become Secretary of State. He said, I want this longer and stronger deal, meaning I want things like the ICBMs that Iran was building, things like terrorism, support for terrorism. As I said earlier in your podcast, Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. Again, that is not a political designation by a political party. That is an analytic designation by multiple administrations, by career people looking at global terrorism around the world. And so we thought the biggest problem that we have with the JCPOA is that it gave Iran billions of dollars of sanctions relief. And what did they use it for? They used it. Let me give you a hint. They did not use it for hospitals or for public health infrastructure that would have helped during COVID, right? They didn't build new schools. They didn't build new roads. They didn't do any of this stuff. And instead, they used that money to fund terrorist groups around the region, around the Middle East, that would attack our friends and allies. Just to go full circle, what we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast. And so any deal would really need to encompass that. But this current administration, doesn't really have any leverage. They could change their policy and have leverage, but changing their policy and having leverage would be similar to what's going on in the border, which is they would have to admit that they just did everything, undid all of the great policies that were working because it had Trump's name on them, not because it wasn't the right policies. And so they could change their policy at the border. They could change their policy with Iran, but it would be forcing them to admit that we were right. So I'm skeptical that will happen.
I sure am too. I mean, you wonder, are they willfully doing these things? Are they so proud? Are they ignorant? Are they truly against America? I mean, you have such great, I think, really great perspective here. And I appreciate you sharing this with us. I have one last quick question because I know you do have to go. But as you look around at everything that's going on right here, the threats that our own country is facing, I'm wondering if you could share with us what you think to be one of the greatest threats that we're facing here at home, that the Biden administration is either over their head in or demonstrating total incompetence. What do you think that is? I know our members have their ideas and they're quite smart and they care about the issues, but we see so much happening right here at home.
Oh gosh. All right. I'm going to think about that one for a second. While I'm deciding which threat I think is the biggest, because I normally go through the laundry list of them.
There are so many.
I know what I'm going to answer. What I would say is, listen, for my colleagues in the Biden administration who are serving, we have very different worldviews, but I don't ever question or doubt their patriotism. They certainly don't see, we do not see the world the same way. They vehemently disagreed with us over Iran. I think in a healthy democracy, this is what we do. We debate, we fight. I say, I think you're wrong. And they say, but I think you're wrong. And we're still neighbors and citizens and patriots. And I do believe everyone that is serving in the Biden administration, again, different worldview than mine, but I do believe that they love this country. And I just think they're a little naive about how they defend it. So I think the long-term threat, no doubt, is the Chinese Communist Party. The near-term threat, the things that I think that we should be concerned about, is the fall of Afghanistan, obviously, of the government of Afghanistan, because I worry with Al-Qaeda and ISIS having the ability, now that we're totally gone. And by the way, this over-the-horizon strike capability is that's big words that are made up by people in Washington to distract you guys. It doesn't work, right? You have to have intelligence capabilities and diplomats and military personnel on the ground. Doesn't mean you need 100,000 troops, right? No one is saying that, but with us being totally gone and leaving in the manner that we did, which precipitated the fall of the government of Afghanistan. Again, this is another situation where we need to have, I feel like we need to have a lesson about the concept of leverage. It's hard to get the Taliban to do what we're going to do when we don't literally and figuratively have a gun to their head. And we can talk about economic leverage all we want, but the Chinese are sitting right there. They're much closer than us. In fact, they share a very small border with Afghanistan. And so if we're not going to, if we take away all of the financial incentives, they can fill it in. So that's just an important thing to remember when you hear people talking about the financial or economic incentives that we have over the Taliban. We only have that whenever there is a credible military threat, as with most rogue regimes, right? That was one of the concepts that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, always talked about with me, and I learned so much with him, as Morgan, we are going to see the world for the way it is, right? We're not going to see the world for the way we want it to be. We're not going to see it, for the way we think it is in Paris with other diplomats sipping champagne, which sounds lovely right now. I would love to do that. I haven't been to Paris in a while, but that's not the way the world actually is, right? That's certainly not the way the Taliban is. So long-term, medium-term, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind the biggest threat is the Chinese Communist Party. In the near term, over the next, 3 years of this administration, I worry about Al-Qaeda and ISIS reconstituting in Afghanistan without us there and developing a capability to hit the homeland again. And on that happy note, aren't you glad you booked me today?
Yeah, I am so happy.
Yeah.
And I know you've got to run, so I've got to let you go here. But I want to tell you, I am in awe of you. I think you're just a brilliant woman.
Nice.
When I read your resume, I said, how can I be more like Morgan to better understand the issues? And so, we appreciate it, because this is the kind of information that you're not going to hear necessarily on mainstream. The detail that you've given us is helpful. And thank you for what you're doing. I could talk to you for hours. I do hope that we can have you back. It's just been remarkable. I love hearing about your many views.
If it makes you feel any better, I never cook and I never clean. So that's because I'm spending my time reading about hypersonic weapons.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm coming up close to you. It's been a while, but I'm figuring out new ways to get my laundry done these days. But this has been wonderful. I know. Thank you so much for joining us, and to everybody out there. We appreciate you. I'm sure we'll have you back. Morgan Ortagus, thanks again for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Better for America podcast. To learn more about Amac and all it has to offer, visit us at www.amac.us.